Before we begin, please note that this is a work of fiction intended for entertainment purposes only. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Genevieve Hartley was elbow-deep in calculations when her housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, brought it in on a silver tray, an affectation Genevieve had tried to discourage but the older woman insisted upon. For respectability's sake, Miss Hartley, you may be a woman in trade, but you needn't advertise it. Genevieve set down her compass and wiped the graphite from her fingers. The envelope was heavy, expensive, the kind of paper that announced wealth before the seal was ever broken. She turned it over and felt her heart perform a sickening lurch. The Davenport crest, a lion rampant over crossed swords. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. 7 years. 7 years since she'd seen that crest on anything but the occasional society page, announcing the Duke of Ashmont's attendance at some ball or another. 7 years since she'd been meant to bear that name herself. Miss Hartley. Mrs. Davies's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you quite well? You've gone pale. I'm fine. Genevieve's voice sounded steadier than she felt. Thank you, Mrs. Davies. That will be all. The housekeeper withdrew with obvious reluctance, and Genevieve stared at the letter as if it might burst into flames. Her hand trembled as she broke the seal. Not the Duke's personal seal, she noted. This were from his secretary, Miss Hartley. His Grace the Duke of Ashmorn requests the honor of your professional consultation regarding urgent structural matters at Ashmorn Hall. The estate has suffered significant damage, and His Grace has been informed that you possess expertise in restoration architecture that may prove invaluable. His Grace offers compensation at triple your standard rate and asks that you reply with all possible haste, as the situation is dire. Your servant, James Crawford, Secretary to the Duke of Ashmorn. Genevieve read it twice, then a third time. Then she began to laugh, a sharp, bitter sound that held no humor whatsoever. Christopher Davenport, the man who had left her standing at the altar in front of 300 witnesses, the man who had destroyed her reputation, her future, her family's standing. That man was now asking for her help, and offering triple her rate, as if money could paper over humiliation. She should burn the letter. She should send back a reply so cutting it would make his secretary weep. She should. Genevieve stopped, looked at the unfinished drawings on her desk, thought of the small cottage she lived in, comfortable but modest, thought of the whispers that still followed her in certain circles, even here in Millbrook where she'd built a new life. Triple rate, and the chance to walk through Ashmorn Hall not as a discarded bride, but as the professional whose expertise the mighty Duke required. She reached for her pen. 2 weeks earlier, Christopher Davenport, Duke of Ashmorn, stood in the wreckage of the Eastern Wing and wondered if this was what divine judgment looked like. The collapse had happened at dawn. He'd been in the library. He spent most nights there now, unable to sleep in the ducal apartments where the ceilings were beginning to bow ominously. The sound had been catastrophic, a grinding roar like the earth itself splitting open, followed by an avalanche of stone and timber that seemed to go on forever. When the dust settled, a third of the Eastern Wing was simply gone, reduced to rubble. 4 centuries of Davenport history crumbled into dust because Christopher had been too drunk, too depressed, too cowardly to maintain the estate his ancestors had entrusted to him. Your Grace, his estate manager, William Foster, approached carefully, as one might approach a wounded animal. The surveyors have completed their assessment. And Christopher's voice was hoarse. He'd been breathing dust and guilt for hours. It's worse than we feared. The collapse wasn't isolated. It exposed fundamental weaknesses throughout the structure. Water damage in the foundations, rot in the support beams, stress fractures in the load-bearing walls. Foster hesitated. Your Grace, they are recommending we evacuate the entire hall. They say the whole structure is at risk. Christopher closed his eyes. Ashmorn Hall had stood for 400 years. It had survived civil wars, plagues, fires, and in the 7 years since he'd inherited it, he'd managed to bring it to the brink of ruin. 7 years, the same amount of time since. He pushed the thought away violently. He'd become very good at not thinking about Genevieve Hartley, about the way she'd looked in her wedding gown, the morning sunlight turning her veil to gossamer, about the moment he'd fled through the vestry door like a thief, leaving her standing alone at the altar. He'd been good at not thinking about a lot of things, which was why he was standing in the ruins of his ancestral home, surveying the physical manifestation of every failure he'd tried to drown in brandy. The surveyors, Christopher said carefully. Did they say it could be saved? Foster's expression was answer enough. They said would need a miracle, Your Grace. The kind of architect who understands historical structures, who can diagnose not just the symptoms but the underlying causes. Someone who can think creatively about restoration without destroying the building's integrity. He paused. They said would need someone like the person who saved the Hartwick estate. Christopher's head snapped up. Hartwick? I didn't know Hartwick was in danger. 3 years ago, apparently, the whole north wing was collapsing. Same sort of cascading structural failure. Everyone said it was hopeless. Then Lord Pemberton brought in some architect from Millbrook. A woman, if you can believe it. She completely rebuilt the foundations, redesigned the support systems, saved the entire structure. Pemberton says it's stronger now than when it was built. Millbrook. The word hit Christopher like a fist to the stomach. This architect, he said, though he already knew. Some part of him had always known. What's her name? Hartley, Your Grace. Miss Genevieve Hartley. Genevieve arrived at Ashmorn Hall on a grey morning that matched her mood. She'd borrowed Lord Pemberton's carriage for the journey, and had spent the 2-hour ride reminding herself that this was business. Professional, nothing more. But when the hall came into view through the morning mist, her careful composure cracked. It was dying. That was the only word for it. The eastern wing sagged like a broken limb, its windows dark and empty as skull sockets. Tops covered sections of the roof, flapping mournfully in the wind. The garden, she remembered, manicured to perfection, bursting with roses, had gone wild, and the drive was rutted with holes that spoke of long neglect. She'd been meant to be Mistress Hay, to raise children in these halls, to grow old watching the seasons change over these grounds. The loss of it rose in her throat like bile. Steady, she murmured to herself. You're not that girl anymore. The carriage stopped at the main entrance, and Genevieve stepped down before the footman could assist her. She was dressed for work, a practical navy wool dress with minimal ornamentation, sturdy boots, her leather satchel of tools slung across her body. Her hair was pinned severely back. She looked like what she was, a professional architect arriving to assess a client's property. The door opened before she could knock, and there he was. Christopher Davenport looked like a man who'd been waging a war against himself and losing. He'd always been handsome, dark hair, gray eyes, the kind of aristocratic features that made society mothers shove their daughters in his direction. But the golden prince she remembered had been hollowed out, replaced by someone sharper and more desperate. He was thinner, his face all angles and shadows. His eyes, once filled with easy charm, now held something that looked like haunted recognition. Miss Hartley. His voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it much lately. Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would. Genevieve met his gaze coolly. She'd practiced this moment for 2 weeks. You're paying triple my standard rate, Your Grace. That buys considerable certainty. Something flickered in his expression. Pain, perhaps, or shame. Good, of course. Very businesslike. He stepped back from the door. The damage is extensive. I should show you. First, Genevieve interrupted, we establish terms. I'm here for preliminary assessment only. If I determine the whole can be saved, I'll provide you with an estimate of time and cost. If I determine it cannot, you will pay me for today's consultation and we part ways. You will not question my professional judgment. You will not interfere with my work. And you will not, she held his gaze, discuss anything of a personal nature. Our past is irrelevant to this business arrangement. Are we understood? Christopher's throat worked. Perfectly. Then show me the damage. The eastern wing was worse than she'd imagined. Genevieve moved through the rubble with grim focus, her trained eye cataloging every crack, every point of failure, every warning sign that had been ignored. And there had been warning signs. She could see them everywhere. Water stains that spoke of years of leaks, mortar that had crumbled from freeze-thaw cycles, settlement cracks that had been papered over rather than addressed. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe. This was decades of deferred maintenance compounding into disaster. Christopher followed her at a respectful distance, answering Hette's questions with surprising accuracy. He knew the building intimately, knew which sections had been added in which century, which walls were original, which modifications had been made. Despite everything, he loved this place. She could hear it in his voice when he spoke of the long gallery where his grandmother had hung Italian paintings, the library where his father had taught him Latin. which made it all the more incomprehensible that he'd let it reach this state. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. She was examining a support column, noting the way the wood had rotted from the inside out, and suddenly she couldn't contain it anymore. Why did you let it get this bad? This kind of decay doesn't happen overnight, Your Grace. This is years of neglect. Silence. Then, after the wedding, I discovered the truth about Lord Blackwood. Genevieve's hand stilled on the column. She'd forbidden personal discussion. But that name. She turned slowly to face him. Marcus Blackwood, she said flatly. You knew. Christopher looked stricken. I suspected. Eventually, he'd courted me before you, and he didn't take rejection well. But I had no proof, and by then it hardly mattered. The damage was done. Christopher's hands clenched at his sides. It took me 6 months to discover he'd forged those letters. The ones that claimed you were only marrying me for my fortune, that you'd called me a pompous fool, that the whole thing was a scheme between you and your father. His voice cracked. He was so careful. He had witnesses, people I trusted, who swore they'd heard you say these things. The letters were in your handwriting. I believed him because he'd been my friend since Oxford, and I was too arrogant to imagine he'd lie. Genevieve felt the old wound splitting open. You could have asked me. I know. You could have shown me the letters, demanded an explanation. I know. Instead, you fled through the vestry door and left me standing at the altar in front of 300 witnesses, including my dying father, who spent his last months knowing I'd been publicly humiliated because I'd trusted you. Christopher flinched as if struck. I know, he whispered. Genevieve, Don't. She held up a hand. You wanted to know why I'm willing to work for you? Because you were right to offer triple rate. That's what it costs to purchase my professional expertise while swallowing the fact that I'm standing in the house that should have been my home, speaking to the man who destroyed my life. Her voice was cold, controlled. So let's keep this professional, shall we? I have work to do. She turned back to the column, but her hands were shaking. Behind her, Christopher was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. When I discovered the truth, when Blackwood's debts caught up with him and the whole scheme unraveled, I tried to find you. I searched for 8 months, but your father had died, and you'd vanished. No one in London knew where you'd gone. I hired investigators. I wrote to every Hartley in the parish registers. You disappeared completely. Genevieve kept her eyes on the column. I changed my name. Briefly, used my mother's maiden name, Sullivan. I didn't want to be found, especially not by you. I don't blame you. A pause. When I finally gave up, when I accepted that I'd lost you forever, I started drinking. Heavily. Let the estate managers handle everything while I tried to drown in brandy what I couldn't fix with apologies. By the time I sobered up enough to realize the damage here, it was far too late. Despite herself, Genevieve felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite sympathy. She crushed it. Ruth, you're right. I know I'm right. I'm always right about structures, people, or buildings. Both will collapse if you don't maintain them properly. She moved to examine another section of wall. I'll need access to the original architectural plans and the household accounts for the last 15 years. I need to understand the history of maintenance and repairs. Of course, anything you need. Genevieve pulled out her notebook, began sketching the damage patterns. I'll conduct a full survey over the next 3 days. Don't expect quick answers. If this can be saved, and I'm not convinced it can, it will require extensive work. We're talking about rebuilding from the foundations up in some sections. Minimum 2 years, possibly 3. Money isn't an obstacle. She glanced up sharply. Everyone says that until they see the bill. My grandfather was wiser than I've proven to be. His investments have continued to generate income even while I've been neglectful. I can afford whatever it takes. Genevieve studied him for a long moment. He looked sincere. He also looked exhausted, as if standing there confessing his failures was costing him everything he had left. She looked away first. I'll need a room, somewhere I can work and store my equipment. Not in the family wing. The old estate office. It's in the west wing, structurally sound. It has good light, a large table. Fine. Have someone bring my things there. And your grace. She met his eyes. Stay out of my way. The second day of her survey began before sunrise. The estate office had been hastily converted into a bedroom workshop combination. Someone, presumably Christopher, had arranged for a bed, a washstand, and had cleared the large oak desk of everything except a lamp and an inkwell. Her architectural tools were laid out with surprising care. She ignored the gesture. Gratitude was dangerous. After a quick breakfast brought by a novice maid, Genevieve began her systematic survey. She started with the foundations, which meant crawling through the undercroft with a lantern, making notes about water infiltration patterns, checking stone integrity, measuring settlement. She was under the south wing, examining a worrying crack in the foundation wall, when she heard footsteps. "I thought I told you to stay out of my way." She didn't look up from her measurements. "Technically, you told me to stay out of your way while you're working. But you can't work down here without someone holding a second lantern. It's too dark, and it's dangerous to work alone." Christopher's voice came from somewhere behind her. "I'm not interfering. I'm providing illumination." Genevieve bit back a sharp retort. He was right. Damn him. "Fine. Hold the light steady and don't talk." They worked in silence for nearly an hour, Genevieve measuring and recording while Christopher held the lantern without complaint. Despite herself, she found his presence not unwelcome. He seemed to understand instinctively where she needed the light, moving smoothly as she progressed along the foundation wall. "Hey," she said finally, pointing to where water had eroded the mortar between stones. "This is your primary problem. Water has been infiltrating for decades, probably from a drainage issue in the courtyard above. Every winter, it freezes and expands, slowly pushing these stones apart. The foundation has been weakening for years, and the weight of the eastern wing finally exceeded what the compromised structure could bear." Christopher leaned in to look, and Genevieve was suddenly, uncomfortably aware of how close he was in the confined space. She could smell him, not cologne, but soap and something else, something that tugged at memories she'd worked hard to bury. She moved away abruptly. "I need to check the courtyard drainage." Back above ground, in the cold morning air, Genevieve felt like she could breathe again. This was a mistake. She should leave, send an estimate by post, recommend another architect. Being in Christopher's presence was awakening things she'd thought safely dead. But when she looked back at Ashmorn Hall, at the wounded beauty of it, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. The building wasn't responsible for Christopher's failures, and it deserved better than to crumble into dust. "Miss Hartley." Christopher had emerged from the undercroft, brushing dust from his coat. He was dressed simply today. No cravat, just a shirt and waistcoat, clothes that could get dirty. Working clothes. "Are you all right?" "Fine. I need the original drainage plans for the courtyard. They should be in the estate archives. I'll have them brought to your office. And I need to speak with your longest-serving staff member, someone who's been here at least 30 years. They'll remember when problems first appeared. Mrs. Hadley, the housekeeper. She's been here since she was a girl, nearly 50 years now." Genevieve nodded, making notes. "Have her meet me at 2 o'clock. "Of course." He hesitated. "Genevieve. Miss Hartley." "Miss Hartley," he corrected carefully. "I know you said no personal discussion, but I think you should know something. Marcus Blackwood is dead." She looked up sharply. "He fled to France when his debts caught up with him. Died in a duel 3 years ago, over a card game. I thought you might want to know he can't hurt you again." Genevieve felt nothing. The man who'd orchestrated her humiliation was dead, and she felt nothing at all. "Thank you for the information. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have measurements to record." She walked away before he could see the lie in her eyes, because she didn't feel nothing. She felt a savage, bitter satisfaction that the man who destroyed her future had gotten a fraction of what he deserved, and she felt guilty for that satisfaction, which made her angry at Christopher all over again for stirring up emotions she'd worked so hard to bury. This was going to be a very long 3 days. Leslie. Self-destruction doesn't absolve you of responsibility, Your Grace. If anything, it compounds your failures. You didn't just abandon me. You abandoned everyone who depended on this estate. The tenants, the staff, your own legacy. Mrs. Hadley turned out to be a treasure trove of information. The elderly housekeeper had watched Ashmorn Hall's slow decline with the helpless frustration of someone who knew something was wrong but lacked the authority to fix it. "It started with the roof, miss," she said, settled in Genevieve's office with tea. "Must be 20 years ago now. The old Duke, His Grace's father, kept meaning to have it repaired properly, but there was always something more pressing. He'd patch the worst spots and say he'd deal with it come spring. But spring would bring planting season, autumn brought harvest, winter was too cold to work. She shook her head sadly. After he died and young Master Christopher inherited, well, the wedding trouble happened right off, and after that, he stopped caring. Genevieve finished quietly. Not stopped caring. Miss started hurting too much to care. There's a difference. Mrs. Hadley's eyes were shrewd. Begging your pardon for speaking plain, but I watched you too during the engagement. I saw how he looked at you, like you were the sun and moon and stars all together. When the wedding fell apart, it broke something in him. Broke him worse than losing his parents, I think. Genevieve set down her teacup with a sharp click. Mrs. Hadley, I appreciate your candor, but I'm not making excuses for him, miss. What he did was wrong. Unforgivable, some would say. But I've kept house for 3 generations of Davenports, and I know when a man's punishing himself. These last 7 years, His Grace has been doing a right thorough job of it. She stood, smoothing her apron. You asked me about the house's history. I've told you, but perhaps you needed to hear a bit of the Duke's history too. After she left, Genevieve sat staring at her notes without seeing them. She didn't want to hear about Christopher's suffering. Didn't want to imagine him broken and drinking himself to death in this mausoleum. Didn't want to feel the traitorous stirring of empathy that Mrs. Hadley's words had awakened. She wanted him to be a villain. Simple, uncomplicated, easy to hate. But nothing about Christopher Davenport had ever been simple. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Come in. Christopher entered carrying a wooden box. I found this in my mother's things. I thought, it belongs to you. He set the box on her desk and stepped back, as if afraid to get too close. Genevieve opened it with trembling hands. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a mother's pearl necklace. I kept it safe, Christopher said quietly. You left it in your dressing room at the Hall. That morning. I've kept it safe all these years, hoping I'd have a chance to return it. Genevieve lifted the pearls, feeling their familiar weight. Her mother had worn them every Sunday to church, had clasped them around Genevieve's neck the morning of the wedding that never was, with tears in her eyes, saying, Your grandmother wore these when she married, and I wore them, and now you. 3 generations of love, my darling. Only there had been no wedding, no love, just humiliation and heartbreak. Thank you, she managed through the tightness in her throat. This, thank you. Christopher nodded, already moving toward the door. Wait. The word escaped before she could stop it. Mrs. Hadley said you searched for me. For 8 months. He stopped but didn't turn around. Yes. Why? Because I loved you. His voice was barely above a whisper. Because I'd made the worst mistake of my life, and I couldn't bear the thought of you believing I'd never cared. Because I needed you to know the truth about Blackwood, even if you never forgave me. But you gave up. I thought it was what you wanted. You'd hidden yourself so thoroughly, changed your name, left no trail. It seemed cruel to keep pursuing you when you'd made it so clear you wanted nothing to do with me. Genevieve stayed at his back, at the tension in his shoulders. You should have tried harder. I know. You should have shouted from the rooftops that Blackwood had lied. You should have cleared my name publicly, made sure everyone knew the truth. I know. He finally turned to face her, and the naked anguish in his expression made her breath catch. I know all the things I should have done, Genevieve. I've had 7 years to catalog my failures. But at the time, I was drowning in guilt and shame and self-loathing, and I didn't trust myself to do anything without making it worse. So I did nothing, which was, of course, the worst choice of all. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 7 years of unspoken pain. Can it be saved? Christopher asked finally. The Hall. Genevieve understood what he was really asking. Can we be saved? Can something this broken ever be whole again? She looked down at her mother's pearls, feeling their weight in her hands. Thought of foundations and fractures, of structures that had stood for centuries only to crumble in moments. Thought of all the ways things broke, and all the ways they might, possibly, be repaired. Yes, she said, but it will cost you everything. 6 months later, the reconstruction of Ashmorn Hall's eastern wing was the most complex project Genevieve had ever undertaken. It required complete excavation of the foundations, installation of a modern drainage system, rebuilding of the load-bearing walls, and a new roof structure that would distribute weight more evenly. It also required her to spend 6 days a week at Ashmorn Hall, supervising every detail. She tried to maintain her professional distance. She'd insisted on weekly progress meetings instead of daily check-ins. She kept her interactions with Christopher brief and businesslike. She'd reminded herself constantly that this was just a job, that she was here for the building, not the man who owned it. But slowly, inexorably, her carefully constructed walls began to develop cracks. It started small. Christopher bringing her coffee during long planning sessions with the master mason, because he'd noticed she took it black with 1 sugar. The two of them laughing over a particularly stubborn builder who refused to believe a woman could understand structural mathematics until Genevieve proved him wrong with a single elegant equation. Then larger things. Christopher taking her on walks through the gardens to discuss landscaping, conversations that drifted into talk of books they'd both read, music they both loved, the small beauties that made life worth living even when everything seemed dark. And through it all, Christopher kept his word. He never pressured her, never asked for more than she was willing to give, never discussed their past beyond what was necessary to understand the building's history. But she could feel him there, a constant presence, patient as stone, waiting. The day everything changed was unseasonably warm for November. Genevieve was inspecting the new foundation work in the eastern wing, pleased with the progress. The workers had just left for their midday meal, and she was alone, making final notes. She heard the crack before she saw it, a sound like a rifle shot. She looked up and saw the temporary support beam above her head beginning to bow. Time seemed to slow. She calculated trajectory, weight, distance to safety. 3 seconds. She had 3 seconds, and she needed 4. Then Christopher was there, appearing from the scaffolding where he'd been watching the work. His arms came around her waist, yanking her backward with desperate force. They both went sprawling into the date just as the beam fell, crashing down exactly where she'd been standing with a thunderous impact that sent up a cloud of dust and splinters. For a moment, neither of them moved. Genevieve lay pinned beneath Christopher's body, his heart hammering against her back, his breath rapid and panicked against her neck. She could feel the tremor in his arms where they were still locked around her, as if he couldn't quite convince himself to let go. "Are you hurt?" His voice shook. "Genevieve, for God's sake, tell me you're not hurt." She turned in his arms, difficult in the awkward position, but she managed it and found herself face to face with him, close enough to see the terror still lingering in his gray eyes, close enough to see the small scar above his eyebrow, a faint white line she didn't remember. "I'm fine," she whispered. "You saved my life." Christopher's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "When I saw that beam falling, when I realized you were beneath it, I thought," his voice broke, "I've already lost you once. I couldn't survive it a second time." Christopher. His name felt strange on her tongue after months of your grace and careful formality, but it also felt right, like coming home after a long, cold exile. "We shouldn't do this. Too much has happened. Too much has been broken." "Then let me fix it." His forehead pressed against hers, and she could feel him shaking. "Let me prove I'm not the coward I was. Give me a chance to be the man you deserve then. The man I should have been." Genevieve closed her eyes, feeling tears burn behind her lids. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry for him again, but his arms felt so solid around her, and she was so tired of being strong, of carrying her anger and hurt like armor that grew heavier with every passing day. "You can't just rebuild trust like you rebuild a foundation," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Hearts aren't made of stone." "No," Christopher agreed. "They are more fragile and more precious and infinitely harder to repair. But I'm willing to spend the rest of my life trying, if you'll let me. I'll be patient. I'll be steady. I'll prove, day after day, that you're safe with me, that I'll never run from you again." The master mason's voice called from somewhere outside. "Miss Hartley, Your Grace, is everything all right?" We heard a crash. The spell broke. Genevieve pulled away from Christopher, her face flushing as she realized they were still lying in the date, covered in dust, with a dozen workers about to discover them in a thoroughly compromising position. She stood quickly, brushing off her skirts with hands that trembled. "We're fine," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I need to examine that beam. This shouldn't have happened. She was retreating into professionalism again, Christopher realized, using work as a shield. But he'd felt her soften in his arms, had seen the answering emotion in her eyes. For the first time in 7 years, he felt something that might almost be hope. The support beam had failed because of a hidden flaw in the timber, an internal knot that hadn't been visible on inspection but had created a weak point under stress. It was nobody's fault, just one of those unpredictable failures that occasionally happened even with the best materials and planning. But it had nearly killed Genevieve, and that night, alone in the estate office that had become her workspace, she couldn't stop shaking. She'd faced death today, not in some distant, abstract way, but immediately and physically. She'd calculated her trajectory and known, with absolute certainty, that she wasn't going to make it. And Christopher had saved her. She kept replaying the moment, his arms around her, the desperate strength with which he'd pulled her to safety, the terror in his voice when he'd asked if she was hurt. That hadn't been duty, obligation. That had been love, which terrified her more than the falling beam. Because loving Christopher Davenport had nearly destroyed her once. She'd spent 7 years rebuilding herself from the ruins of that love, forging something harder and stronger. And now he was asking her to risk it all again, to trust that this time would be different, that he'd changed, that the foundation between them could be made solid. A knock at the door made her jump. She knew who it was before she opened it. Christopher stood on her threshold holding a bottle of brandy and 2 glasses. "I thought you might be having trouble sleeping." "I know I am." Genevieve should have sent him away, should have reminded him of her rules about personal interaction, should have done 1,000 things other than what she did, which was step aside and let him in. He poured them both generous measures without asking, and handed her one. They stood on opposite sides of a desk, still maintaining some pretense of distance, and drank in silence for a moment. "Thank you," Genevieve said finally. "For today, I would have been badly injured, at best. More likely killed. You don't need to thank me. I'd walk through fire for you, Genevieve. I thought you knew that. I don't know anything anymore." The admission escaped before she could stop it, loosened by brandy and exhaustion and the adrenaline crash from her near death. 7 years ago, I thought I knew you. Thought I knew what we had together. I was wrong then. How do I know I'm not wrong now? Christopher was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You can't. There's no guarantee, no proof I can offer that will make you certain. All I can give you is time and consistency and the truth, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. That's not enough. I know, but it's all I have." He set down his glass. "There's something else you should know. Something I haven't told you because I was afraid it would sound like I was making excuses. But if we're being honest, truly honest, you deserve to know all of it." Genevieve felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What?" "The morning of our wedding, Blackwood didn't just show me forged letters. He told me your father was dying of a wasting disease. He said your family was nearly bankrupt, that marrying me was your only chance to avoid complete social and financial ruin. He said you'd begged him to help you trap me, but he'd refused on principle." Genevieve's breath caught. "My father was ill, but we weren't bankrupt. I know that now. But at the time, the lie worked because it mixed truth with fiction. Your father was dying. That was true. You'd never mentioned it to me, which seemed to support Blackwood's claim that you were hiding things. And I was arrogant enough, paranoid enough, to believe that someone as wonderful as you couldn't possibly actually love me for myself. There had to be some ulterior motive. So you fled. I panicked. I stood in that vestry, looking at those letters, and all I could think was that I'd been played for a fool. That I'd be standing at that altar, proclaiming my love, while you laughed privately at my gullibility. I couldn't face it. Couldn't face you." He met her eyes. "So I ran. Like a coward." "Yes," Genevieve said coldly. "You did. And then I spent 6 months drinking away my shame before I finally sobered up enough to question Blackwood's story. I hired investigators. They discovered he'd been gambling heavily, that he owed massive debts, that he'd been seen at your father's sickbed offering to help with medical expenses, trying to ingratiate himself with your family after I'd disappeared. When I confronted him with the evidence, he fled to France." Christopher's hands clenched on the desk. "By the time I pieced it all together, your father was dead, and you were gone. I spent 8 months searching for you. I combed parish registers, interviewed your father's servants, followed every possible lead. The investigators finally traced you to Millbrook. But by then you'd changed your name to Sullivan. You were living as a widow, they said. You'd built a new life, and you clearly wanted nothing to do with your past. So you gave up, Genevieve said. Not an accusation, just a statement. I thought it was a decent thing to do. The kind thing. You'd escaped the scandal, built a career. Who was I to drag you back into the mess I'd created? He laughed bitterly. I didn't realize until much later that I was just finding another excuse to be a coward. That the truly brave thing would have been to come anyway, to apologize in person, to give you the choice of whether to forgive me rather than making that choice for you. Genevieve drained her brandy in one burning swallow. You're right. That would have been the brave thing. She set down her glass with a sharp click. Do you know what the worst part was? Not the humiliation, though that was terrible. Not even the social exile, though that was worse. The worst part was wondering if I'd somehow driven you away. If I'd been too forward in expressing my feelings, too eager to marry. If I'd said or done something wrong and was simply too stupid to realize it. God, Genevieve. I rewrote our entire courtship in my mind, looking for the moment I'd failed. The moment I'd revealed myself as unworthy of a duke's love. It took me 2 years to stop blaming myself, to understand that you were the one who'd failed, not me. You're right. It was my failure, entirely and completely mine. And now you want me to trust you again, to believe you've changed, to risk my heart on the man who shattered it into so many pieces I didn't think I'd ever get them all back. Christopher's face was pale, but he held her gaze. Yes, though when you put it that way, I realize how monumentally unfair that is. How much I'm asking. How little I deserve. Genevieve stared at him across the desk that separated them, and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. Because he wasn't making excuses. Wasn't asking her to understand or sympathize. He was simply acknowledging the truth of her pain, accepting responsibility for it, and asking, not demanding, not assuming, but asking if there might be a path forward. I don't forgive you, she said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What you did was unforgivable. Something died in Christopher's expression, but he nodded. I understand. But, she took a breath, but I'm willing to see if I can trust you again. Not the trust we had before. That innocent, uncomplicated faith. Something harder. Something that has to be owned, stone by stone, the way we're rebuilding your estate. Hope flickered in his eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to try. Not to go back to what we were, but to see if we can build something new. Something stronger, because it's built on truth instead of illusion. She met his gaze. But Christopher, if you hurt me again, if you run or doubt or fail to trust me when it matters, there won't be a third chance. I'll walk away and never look back. Do you understand? Perfectly. He started to move around the desk, then checked himself. May I? Genevieve nodded, and he closed the distance between them. He took her hands carefully, as if she might break. His thumbs brushed across her knuckles, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. I won't waste this chance, he said. I'll spend every day proving I'm worthy of your trust. And if it takes the rest of my life, if you never fully forgive me, I'll still count myself blessed just to be near you. That's very romantic, Genevieve said dryly, even as her heart raced. But pretty words won't be enough. I need to see action. Consistency. Honesty, even when it's difficult. Then that's what you'll have. He raised her hands to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth racing up her arms. Starting now. Starting with the truth that I love you, Genevieve Hartley. Not the memory of you, not some idealized version, but exactly who you are. The woman who turned pain into purpose, who built a career from nothing, who's brilliant and fierce and unforgiving of failure, especially mine. I love you, and I'll prove it every day, in every way I can. Genevieve felt tears burning behind her eyes again, but this time, she let them fall. I don't love you. Not yet. You broke that. I know. But I want to. I want to see if that broken thing can be repaired. That's more than I deserve, more than I dared to hope for. She pulled her hands free, but only to frame his face, to look at him properly. Don't make me regret this. Christopher, please don't make me regret this. I won't, he promised. And then, because she'd given him permission with her touch, he kissed her. It wasn't like the kisses she remembered from 7 years ago, eager and sweet and innocent. This was something darker, deeper, a kiss that acknowledged everything broken between them, everything that would need to be rebuilt. A kiss that tasted of brandy and tears and hard-won hope. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Genevieve rested her forehead against his. "We're going to do this slowly, carefully, like a restoration project." Christopher laughed, the sound shaky with emotion. "Whatever pace you need. I'm not going anywhere." "Good, because the hall needs at least another 18 months of work, and I need." She trailed off. "Time," Christopher finished. "You need time, and trust, and proof. I know, and I'll give you all of it." 1 year later, the restoration of Ashmore Hall's eastern wing was completed on a crisp October afternoon, almost exactly 2 years after the collapse. Genevieve stood in the long gallery, looking out over the gardens, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The wing was perfect, better than perfect. It was stronger than it had ever been, with modern engineering hidden seamlessly behind period-appropriate facades. The walls were true, the foundations solid, the roof watertight. It would stand for another 400 years. "You've created a miracle." Christopher's voice came from behind her. "Every architect in London said it was impossible, but you did it anyway." Genevieve turned to him, and her heart did that little leap it always did now when she saw him. Over the past year, they'd rebuilt more than just the hall. They'd rebuilt themselves, together, slowly, carefully, with the same attention to detail she gave her architecture. Christopher had been true to his word. He'd been patient when she needed distance, honest even when the truth was painful, present without being overbearing. He'd supported her work, celebrated her successes, and never once asked for more than she was ready to give. And somewhere along the way, without Genevieve quite noticing when it happened, she'd fallen in love with him again. Not the breathless infatuation of youth, but something deeper. A love built on knowledge and choice, on having seen each other at their worst and choosing to stay anyway. It wasn't a miracle, she said. It was careful planning, solid engineering, and excellent materials, plus a client who actually listened to his architect. This client had excellent motivation. "I was trying to impress you." "You succeeded." Genevieve moved to him, lacing her fingers through his in a gesture that still felt new and precious. "The hall is saved, Christopher. Your legacy is secure." The hall was never what mattered most. He brought their joined hands to his lips. "Genevieve, there's something I want to ask you. Something I should have asked properly, 7 years ago, instead of assuming you'd say yes." Her breath caught. "Christopher." He pulled a small box from his pocket, but didn't open it yet. "I'm not the man I was. You're not the woman you were. We've both been broken and rebuilt, and I think we're stronger for it. I know I'm stronger, because loving you taught me what really matters. Not pride or reputation or what other people think. Just you. Just us." He opened the box. Inside was a ring. Not the elaborate confection he'd given her before, but something simpler and more meaningful. A single pearl reset in gold. The band etched with the architectural drawing of Ashmore Hall's eastern wing. The building they'd saved together. "Marry me, Genevieve. Not because I'm a duke and you'd make a perfect duchess. Not because it's expected or convenient. Marry me because we've built something together that's stronger than stone. Because I love you, not who you were, but who you are. Because I want to spend the rest of my life being worthy of you." Genevieve looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the life stretching before them. A year ago, she might have said no, might have needed more time, more proof, more certainty. But she'd watched Christopher grow and change. She'd watched him take responsibility not just for the whole but for his own failures. She'd watched him keep every promise, honor every boundary, show up every single day with honesty and patience and love. And she'd felt herself change too. Felt her anger cool into understanding, her hurt transform into wisdom, her fear give way to hope. "I have conditions," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken 2 years ago. Christopher's lips quirked. "Of course you do. I won't give up my work. I'm an architect, and I'm good at it. I won't become just the Duchess of Ashmore. I'd never ask you to. In fact, I've already fielded 6 requests from neighboring estates. I told them they'd need to negotiate directly with Miss Hartley, or rather, with my wife, as I hoped she'd be." Genevieve felt warmth spreading through her chest. "Second condition, we'll have a small wedding. Just the people who matter. I'm not standing in front of 300 strangers again. We can marry in the chapel here, with just our closest friends. I don't need witnesses. I just need you. Third condition. Her voice softened. You have to promise me that you'll never doubt me again. That when challenges come, and they will, you'll talk to me. Fight with me if necessary, but never walk away. Christopher set down the ring box so he could take both her hands in his. He pressed them to his chest, over his heart. I swear it on my life, on my honor, and on the love I bear you. I will never walk away from you again, Genevieve. You're my foundation, the bedrock everything else is built on. Without you, I crumble. Then yes, Genevieve felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but she was smiling. Yes, Christopher, I'll marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, and then kissed her with such tenderness it made her heart ache. When they pulled apart, both breathless, Genevieve looked down at the ring. Her mother's pearl, reset and made new. Like her, like them. There's one more thing, Christopher said, his eyes dancing. The western wing is structurally sound but badly outdated. I was thinking the nursery could use some renovation. Something with better light, modern heating, room to expand. Genevieve's cheeks warmed, but she met his gaze steadily. I might have some preliminary sketches already drawn up. Might you? He pulled her closer, his hands settling at her waist. How preliminary? Purely theoretical. But she stood on her toes to whisper in his ear, I'm open to field testing. For research purposes. Christopher's laugh was pure joy. I do love a thorough research process. They stood together in the long gallery, surrounded by the building they'd saved, and Genevieve felt the future unfurling before them like a blueprint waiting to be realized. There would be challenges, society would gossip, old wounds might ache. Marriage was complex. But they'd survived worse. They'd found their way back to each other through honesty, patience, and the willingness to build something new from broken pieces. 3 months later, the wedding took place on a January morning so cold the frost turned the chapel windows into diamond lattices. Genevieve walked down the aisle on Lord Pemberton's arm, the man who'd given her first commission, who'd believed in her when no one else would. The gathering was intimate, 20 people who truly mattered. Mrs. Hadley dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The master mason and his wife beamed from the second row. Even some of the workers who'd helped rebuild the hall had been invited. Christopher waited at the altar in the same chapel where his ancestors had married for 400 years. When Genevieve reached him, he took her hand with such reverence it made her breath catch. She wore a simple gown of ivory silk, and in her hair, woven among orange blossoms, were her mother's pearls. Not the necklace Christopher had returned to her, but the ring he'd given her, transformed into a hairpin. Old made new, broken made whole. The vicar spoke the ancient words about love and honor and cherishing. But Genevieve barely heard them. She was too focused on Christopher's eyes, on the promise she saw there, on the absolute certainty that this time, this marriage, would endure. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Christopher kissed her with a tenderness that held all the love and patience and hard-won trust they'd built together. The congregation applauded, and Mrs. Hadley wept openly, and Genevieve felt something lock into place in her chest like a keystone settling into an arch. They walked back down the aisle hand in hand, and the morning sun broke through the frost on the windows, casting patterns of rainbow light across the stone floor. Happy, Duchess? Christopher whispered. Extraordinarily happy, Duke, Genevieve replied. Outside, Ashmorn Hall stood solid and strong, its stones warmed by centuries of sun, its foundations rebuilt and true. Inside, Christopher and Genevieve Davenport began their marriage the way they'd rebuilt the hall, with patience, honesty, and the understanding that the strongest structures were built not on perfection, but on the willingness to repair what had been broken. 7 years ago, he'd left her at the altar, but he'd come back, and together, they built something far more beautiful than anything either of them could have created alone. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear what resonated with you most about Genevieve and Christopher's journey. Please, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. Thank you for watching.